Yesterday, I posted a video to YouTube titled, "How much will you be fined if you buy a new petrol or diesel car?" So far, it's had close to 50,000 views and about 800 comments. So I thought in this video, I'd actually answer some of those comments, because this is clearly a policy that many Australians haven't heard of. It's being snuck in by the government that will increase the cost of motoring whenever anyone goes to buy a new car. Plus, it'll push up the price of existing cars. And yet there's little debate about this, little information about how much more it will cost Australians. So let's go through some of those comments. Firstly, Mark Gillies has written a message. "Cheaper to run with tears, more expensive to buy." But that's only partly correct. Electric cars are more expensive to buy. We can see the cheapest petrol car in the market to buy new is around about $19,000 here in Australia. But the cheapest electric car is around about $37,000, $38,000. So there's something like a $20,000 difference between a petrol car and the equivalent electric car. Some models will be much, much more, others will be less. But it's around about, I'd say on average, at least $20,000. So there's a lot more cost up front. Now the government's telling us, oh, we're going to save you money. Well, how are they saving you money if you have to buy a car that's $20,000 more expensive? And the question, they say, well, they're cheaper to run. Well, I don't know if that is necessarily true. The electric cars are cheaper to run. The electricity doesn't come for free. You're still going to pay for the cost of the electricity. Now, there's an interesting test done recently where a couple of guys compared the costs of two equivalent BMWs, one fully electric, one petrol, driving from Melbourne to Sydney. And they found the cost of the petrol-driven car, the cost of fueling that the petrol costs from Melbourne to Sydney, was $117.88. But the cost of charging the electric car along the way was more. It was $131.92. So the electric car actually cost more than the petrol car. And then that was before there was a substantial increase in the cost of electricity. And also they noted that it took them extra 2 hours of stoppage time waiting around to charge. Good luck trying to do that in the middle of the holiday period. It'd be much longer than 2 hours. So the idea that an electric car is going to be cheaper to run is not necessarily correct. But you've got much higher costs in buying the car to start with. You've also got much higher insurance costs. And the other hidden cost in these electric cars is the depreciation, because we have seen how quickly these cars depreciate compared to your regular petrol and diesel car. So interesting comments for that one. Another comment comes from a Mark B, and he writes, "Has anyone calculated the CO2 per kilometre for electric vehicles? Most of our electricity is generated by coal gas currently, so electric vehicles are charging using this dirty power source. This renewables fantasy is being dumped by most modern economies. Labor is living in some different reality." Well, Mark, the government used to have a calculator that did this, an online calculator. It was called their Green Car Guide, where you could actually look at these things and do the calculations. But because the calculations weren't so favourable, which I pointed out to my old mate Josh Frydenberg when he was the climate change minister, the show showed him that actually some of the electric cars actually had a higher CO2 emissions than the petrol cars. That green guide has disappeared from the website. Now, Volkswagen have done some interesting calculations on this. Firstly, you can see here on this graph of where you have to take into account the higher CO2 emissions that are involved in the manufacturing of these cars, because of the manufacturing of the batteries, higher cost, higher energy. So before you even start, when you get to the starting line, you've got here more than double. You can see on this graph here, the electric car has more than double the CO2 emissions than the equivalent petrol car. So this is where the great nonsense of these electric cars saving CO2 comes in. Every new electric car that is brought onto the market increases CO2 emissions globally. And the question is how quickly, or if you can, offset those CO2 emissions over the life of the vehicle. And you can see here on this Volkswagen graph, you can see here that the crossover point, right, where they say, well, you're the actual break-even point, you have to drive one of these cars 115,000 kilometres fair distance before you will break even, and that is based on the average of the EU electricity grid, which they say is 392 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. So it depends whether you're above how you are, the intensity of the CO2 emissions of the grid that you are charging off, whether that's actually less than that 115,000 kilometres or more. Now, Volkswagen have also done another chart here. You can see where the break-even mileage comes in. It's actually the break-even kilometres, comes in. They've got the mileage on the chart, right? But it's the break-even kilometres. So you can see here grids that have a lot of hydro or nuclear power in them, like Sweden, Ontario, and France. You get a break-even at around 52 to 57,000 kilometres. But you can see here in Germany, you would need to drive one of those cars 314,000 kilometres, which is beyond their design life, before you break even. And interesting here, they say in Australia, you would never get a break even period. So if you bought according to Volkswagen's own data, if you are buying a electric car compared to their petrol car, you will actually increase CO2 emissions. This is the madness of this policy of Albanese and Bowen. Now, there is some argument that, yes, Australia's electricity grid is coming down in its carbon intensity, but we are still a long way away from that 392 grams of CO2, which gets you at 115,000 break even. So just to put that into some context, every Australian state is effectively a separate electricity grid, which has a different carbon intensity. And we have interconnectors which can distribute a small amount of power between them to overcome shortages and excess power transfer power from one state to another. But essentially each state has its own carbon intensity grid. On this graph from OpenNEM, the official data, it shows the carbon intensity of the grid in Australia. You can see the carbon intensity for each state varies greatly. We can see the highest in Victoria is 685, and this is the average of the past 12 months, so it's current data. So 685 kilograms of CO2 per megawatt hour. And if we go to New South Wales, it's 597. Queensland, it's 618. So on those numbers, it looks like you would never achieve to even offset the emission, the higher manufacturing emissions of these cars. And it's even worse because that's the average of the grid. If you look at this next graph here, you can see this is the New South Wales energy over the last 3 days. You can see it's 3 days from 3-day consecutive days, and you can see the yellow colour there is the solar power, the green is the wind, and the black is the coal. So you can see the grid, a lot of solar power comes into the grid, but at night it's coal and how much wind is blowing. Now most of these electric cars are going to be charged on the grid at night. And you can see at night time, you can see the CO2 intensity of the grid is 722 kilograms of CO2 per megawatt hour. Now at that rate, electric cars will never offset their CO2 emissions. The whole thing is a complete and utter nonsense. It is the most ridiculous thing you could ever think of, that we are subsidising all these electric cars and yet the higher manufacturing emissions is unlikely to ever be offset if they are charged in New South Wales, Victoria, or Queensland. The policy is a complete and utter nonsense. So back to the some of the comments in the original post. This is Brett Thampson. He writes, he's having a bit of a crack at me here. There is nothing between Mount Isa and Townsville. Townships of Cloncurry, Julia Creek, Richmond, Charters Towers are not insignificant towns. Now, I apologise to the people in those towns. Yes, I should have said that there was relatively not a lot of civilisation between them. The point that I was making, that these politicians based in Canberra, out of Sydney and Melbourne, that are making all these decisions, really have no comprehension of how remote these areas are and the distances between these towns that are in Australia, Northern Australia and regional Australia, and how unsuitable electric cars are. So yes, I take that point. I've never been to Cloncurry, Julia Creek or Charters Towers. I hope to one day, but if they bring in these electric cars, it's more and more unlikely that many Australians will ever be able to get to these places if all these electric cars are mandated and we get to this net zero nonsense where petrol and diesel cars are simply taken off Australian roads. Another one here, someone having a crack at me. Hey stupid, Kununurra, not Kurunurra. Yes, I apologise. I pronounced that wrong to the people up there in northern Western Australia. Again, that's a place I think, I haven't been there. I think many Australians, or most Australians, haven't been there, but the chances of us actually going to visit these beautiful little country towns and remote towns in Australia become less and less as the government implies and puts these new additional fines and penalties for people that want to drive petrol or diesel cars, because to try and tour around these remote towns in northern Australia in an electric car is just completely impractical. It is actually dangerous, and it's just a nonsense. But that's what the government policy is pushing us towards. Next one, Gerard Canavan writes, so who's going to stand up and state that they will abolish these ridiculous laws? Well, Mr. Dutton had a chance today with his announcement, his big election announcement, where he could have actually come up and he could have said, Australia is a wide brown land. We need to have larger, more powerful cars than what they do in Europe. That is because of our geography and the lifestyle that we had. And I am going to repeal all of these laws, full stop. Just like President Trump has promised that he would do. But we've heard nothing from Peter Dutton and the Liberals. So it looks like that if you vote Liberal or Labor at the moment, these higher penalties, these charges are going to apply. One thing I'll tell you who will stand up and fight for it, and that is the Libertarians that I am proudly a part of. We are opposed to this nonsense of net zero, and we will come out and we will say, if we can get the balance of power in the Senate and get enough people elected to Parliament, our policy will be to repeal this ridiculous legislation in full, get government out of the way, and let Australians decide for themselves what car suits their particular needs the best, without government interference and without government trying to skew the playing field and give inner city people that can drive electric cars an advantage over country and regional people. So if you're against this, come and support us at the Libertarians, because it looks like the Liberal Party are going to play dead and hide under their desk yet again on this policy. There's someone else here, have another go at me, Craig. It's Kununurra. Just saying, yes, I've apologised for that. I pronounced that incorrectly. Greg J. This message needs to be shouted from the rooftops. Where is the Liberal Party? Well, the Liberal Party are hiding under their desks. The Liberal Party have signed up to net zero. So this has got to be part of Liberal Party policy to basically take all petrol and diesel cars off the road. So if you're against this policy, if you don't want to see thousands of dollars, up to $20,000 to be put on the cars that Australians love to buy, Don't vote Liberal. Don't vote Labor. Come and support us at the Libertarians. Aussie Pom writes, what fines are they bringing in on the trucking industry for every new diesel truck? Well, at the moment, this doesn't apply to trucking fleets. At the moment is correct. But with Labor and Liberal both being supporters of net zero, it is just a matter of time until they apply this to trucking fleets as well. So what do they say? First they came for the cars, and I said nothing. Then they came for the utes, and then they came for the four-wheel drives. They're going to eventually come after the trucks with this policy. It's just a matter of time. Actual Facts writes, but Australia will save the whole galaxy from climate change. Well, again, that's a very good point. Australia produces around 1% of man-made CO2 emissions, and those CO2 emissions from man make up around about 3%. The other 97% come from natural sources. And just have a look at this graph that shows the comparisons of the fuel use between China and Australia. The idea that we are going to do something here in Australia when China is thumbing its nose at net zero, making promises out to 2060, good luck with them keeping that, and we are going to go ahead and unilaterally disarm ourselves is a complete and utter nonsense. He's right, Australia has no effect whatsoever on global CO2 levels. John Crowley writes, I'm confused, how do these fines reduce CO2 emissions? Just another excuse for a tax hike. Well, the theory behind this policy is that it will reduce the cost of electric cars compared to petrol cars, and therefore that consumers would go along, and consumers, instead of walking into the car showroom and buying a new petrol car, that they would buy an electric car instead. That electric car comes on and it doesn't, you charge it with electricity rather than fuel, and that reduces CO2 emissions. But that is a complete and utter furphy. As I've shown earlier, you've got the additional manufacturing emissions from these new electric cars that will be unlikely ever to be offset on the Australian grid. Secondly, you've got the fact that as you push the cost of these new cars up, new petrol and diesel cars, people will keep their older cars for a longer period of time. If you really wanted to reduce CO2 emissions, you would encourage people to trade up to new cars, because every generation of cars becomes more efficient, the engines become more efficient. You would encourage people to buy newer model cars. This is going to do the exact opposite. We will end up on the way heading in the direction of Cuba. We'll have all these old cars, all these old petrol and diesel cars on the road, because it'll be so expensive to buy a new petrol and diesel car. Again, it's just another excuse to run up the costs of people, to give subsidies to all these electric car grifters, and to pretend, as governments like to say, we are taking real action on climate change. Mike Hunt, I pronounced that correctly, it's Mr. Mike Hunt. He says people hang on to their older vehicles longer. That is exactly correct. This will increase the age of Australia's vehicle fleet, the exact opposite of what we really want to do. We want to encourage people to upgrade to newer model, more efficient, safer cars that have been designed by the car manufacturers around the world, but this will have the exact opposite effect. It takes us in the direction of Cuba, where we keep our older cars for longer and longer and longer. John Francis, if the coalition gets in, do you think they'll reverse it? Mate, I wish, but we've seen no commitment whatsoever from Peter Dutton. If we did even get a commitment, they have to actually go ahead with it. We heard a lot of promises from the coalition before about how they'd fight against these policies, and they get elected and do the exact opposite. So no, so the only way to reverse this, I say, we need a big turnout of votes for the Libertarians and the other freedom parties to show that Australians are not going to put up with this government interfering in the market, government bureaucrats telling us what to do and telling us what type of car we have to drive. Fred Walsh writes, Save your BS. What proof do you have of any of this? Well, Fred, go and read the legislation. I'll put the links below. Go and read the explanatory memorandum and the Bill's Digest about all this. And go and read some of the commentary from some of the car manufacturers that have explained how they will increase the cost of cars, Fred. That's what I suggest you do. And I suggest, Fred, whatever you do, don't listen to the ABC because they won't give you the information, the Guardian or the Sydney Morning Herald, because those media outlets will simply give you complete misinformation. They won't give you the details of this whatsoever. And if you're relying on Albanese and Bowen to explain it to you, how much you're going to increase the cars, well, mate, good luck to you. M World, CO2 will be emitted somewhere. Electric cars just move the location. Well, that's exactly correct. As I said before, firstly, you've got the initial manufacturing emissions, high manufacturing emissions, more than double for an electric car as compared to a petrol car. So you've got more CO2 emissions before you start. And then the energy has to come from somewhere. And we know that most of these cars will be charged overnight on the grids in Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria, where the CO2 emissions are basically coal-fired. It's mainly coal-fired power are driving our grid at night when these cars will be charged, and the actual CO2 emissions will be higher. You'll never offset the initial manufacturing emissions. Benny's again had a go at my Benny T's having a crack at my pronunciation. It's Kununurra, idiot. Okay, yes, thank you. Yes, I'm sorry. Mate, I'm sorry, Benny. Yes, I got that pronunciation wrong. He says he lives in Catherine watching this, and it serves about 10,000 people. Look, mate, again, look, I apologise for the pronunciation. And yes, Catherine is, I'm sure, a beautiful town to live in. But the point I was making, as I said, that these Australian politicians based in the cities of Sydney and Canberra and Melbourne have no idea whatsoever and no comprehension of how remote these regional towns are in Northern Territory, Northern Queensland and Western Australia. Someone here goes on here, analog bliss, rubbish. Firstly, EU6 CO2 standards are currently 98 grams of CO2 per kilometre, well below the current Australian standard. Hence, Australia must move quickly to match these figures. Otherwise, car manufacturers will be dumping all their non-EU cars on us. This is complete nonsense. Absolute, unmitigated nonsense. The idea that these car manufacturers have all these cars sort of like, in these huge lots that they're going to go and dump upon Australia is complete and utter rubbish. You cannot compare. There's no why should Australia have the same emission standards as Europe. Compare the size of Europe with the population of Europe to the size of Australia. Well, most of the population is concentrated in very large cities that have good transportation links because of the size distance between city to city. Australia's remoteness, our geography, our small population compared to our size, means that we should have completely ignore whatever Europe is doing and to think we should be copying Europe. Complete and utter nonsense. But this is the garbage that these electric car promoters keep doing because they want to simply, they're grifters that want to line their own pockets. Slater RH says, the little pink car suits him. Well, yes, it actually does. The pictures of Mr. Albanese driving his little pink car, just shows, mate, the bloke has no idea of what's involved in off-road motoring, and Australians that love their big V8s, Australians that love their motor cars, Albanese from the inner city suburbs of Sydney, and a politician that has basically probably had a free government car all his life, or most of his life, simply has no idea, and those images of his little pink car suits him down to the ground. Yes, someone else having a crack at me on my pronunciations. Yes, sorry, got that wrong. Okay. PW Paul West writes, and it will push the cost of second-hand cars up as well. 100% right. as new cars become more and more expensive because of these fines and penalties, new petrol and diesel cars, it will push up the cost of second-hand cars. And ironically, as the subsidies come in for electric cars, it will increase the depreciation and push down the cost of those cars. So again, complete utter opposite of what the policy is meant to achieve. Its outcomes will be the exact opposite. So often what we see where the government interferes in the market. India Thailand writes, Isa is a city, not a town. Well, look, I apologise. Mount Isa likes to call itself a city. I understand that. I think its population is around about 18 to 20,000, which makes it, in my book, a big town. I remember in Sydney here, we've got some 5 million people. So if you had 100 Mount Isas together, you wouldn't even have half of Sydney's population. So yes, look, apologies, it's semantics. Again, the point I was making is the remoteness of these towns and how you just can't have the same car standards that you would in a big city like Sydney and Melbourne as you would in these remote areas. Here's someone having a crack at me. K Jesus 1. Still doing what you do best, Craig. ... Pity you don't actually do something positive for the people of Australia. Okay. One of the things I can do positive for the people of Australia is make sure that those that live in regional areas are not being fined and penalised up to $20,000 when they go and buy a new car for pointless virtue signalling of a Labor government. You know, seriously. John Sentidis writes, they're trying to stop us having these cars. They want us in 15-minute cities. No way. Well, John, you're right. The fine of the $25,000 or $25,000 on some of these big V8s, that's only through to 2029. After that, they'll crank these fines up even higher. So they'll make these cars completely unaffordable. Remember, Labor and Liberal have both signed up to net zero. So that means the extinction of petrol and diesel driven cars from the market. That's what happens if you sign up to these policies. So that's exactly right. They want to stop. It's not so much about forcing us into electric cars. It's about taking our petrol and diesel cars off us. And for most people, forcing people onto the electric bus in big 15-minute cities. That's the ultimate goal of these policies. This is just these fines and penalties are just a stepping stone on the way of getting us there. Billy Funt, 61 writes, Flintstones meet the Flintstones, yabba dabba doo. Well, he makes a good point here because the Flintstones mobile with good old Fred Flintstone, well, that's the ultimate low emissions vehicle. It just shows the nonsense of when they talk about high efficiency vehicles. The efficiency that they are talking about is fuel efficiency. So Fred Flintstone's mobile would have done unlimited number of kilometres for a litre of petrol because it doesn't use petrol. It's a trade-off. Just talking about efficiency, if you make the cars smaller, if you take the weight out of them, if you want to really have a so-called fuel-efficient car, ride a bike or get a Flintstone mobile. It's the offset, it's the trade-off. Let Australians decide what fuel efficiency of a car suits them depending on the size of their family, their needs, the distances they have to drive, the businesses that they are involved in. Get government out of the way and let the public decide. Each individual decide what is best for themselves. Okay, Max Mountain writes here, stupid. Most people live on the coast in a city. What's wrong with them driving less polluting cars? Well, Max, the premise of your statement is flawed. The idea that just because it is an electric car is less polluting is simply, the evidence is simply not there. In fact, there's many studies that show that these electric cars are actually more polluting. Now, while that might sound a little bit counterintuitive, The modern cars, a modern petrol and diesel car is so efficient that most of the pollution doesn't come out of the tailpipe. It comes out of the wear and tear on the tyres and the brakes, and also on when the weight when you dig up the roads and wear down the bitumen and the gravel from the driving around. Now, these electric cars, because they are much greater weight compared to a comparable petrol car, because of the weight of the batteries, you have more wear and tear on the tyre, so you have more pollution from the tyres, and you have more pollution of them wearing down the bitumen on the road surfaces. And there are many studies that show that these actual electric cars kick up more atmospheric pollution in form of particulate matter than they do diesel cars. So again, this is just another furphy, just another piece of misinformation that these electric car salesmen continue to push out as they seek more and more subsidies. Crazy 88 writes, sacrificing our way of life on the cross of green ideology. How stupid are we? Exactly right. This policy is futile. It's counterproductive. It does exactly the opposite of what it does. It is just one of those stupid, green, feel-good policies that we see time and time again from the Labor Party, the Greens, the Teals, and sadly also the Liberal Party, that has no effect, that actually damages the environment and does nothing other than let some people feel good about themselves. Stealth 5959 writes, are the Liberal and National Party going to abolish this tax when they're elected? Well, Mr. Dutton's made no commitment, so if he doesn't stand up and speak out against this, no. So if you vote Liberal, you'll be getting this tax. Send a message at this next election. Vote for the Libertarians or one of the other Freedom Independent parties. Make sure you preference each of the others between them. Put Labor and Liberal right down the bottom, and send a message that you don't want to see petrol and diesel cars taxed. The cost of living is high enough in this country already. We don't want to have an additional fine or penalty for some virtue signaling WEF climate agenda policy. 69429 Boss writes, make no mistake, the death of electric vehicles will be the resale value. Forget the infrastructure issues, the mining issues, the range issues. When you pay $80,000 for a Tesla and you trade it in 3 years later for $25,000, you'll never buy another one, no matter how green you are. Latest stats out of America, 50% of EV owners do not buy another EV. Well, that's exactly right. It's surprising that we've seen the demand for these EVs is falling. People who have purchased EVs have had so many bad experiences, they say they wouldn't buy another one. And one of the major costs that, of course, the government and Bowen and Albanese completely ignore is the depreciation cost of these vehicles, these electric vehicles. They depreciate very, very quickly, much faster than a diesel or a petrol car. And that depreciation difference is only going to increase because of the taxes that this new tax and fine and penalty regime. Barely Awake writes, how can they possibly implement and enforce this? Well, that's a great question. Firstly, they'll implement and enforce it by creating a giant new bureaucracy in Canberra. Thousands and thousands of more employees in this new bureaucracy doing completely unproductive work other than tracking how much CO2 is emitted from each car. And we wonder why productivity is going backwards in this nation. We have all these giant bureaucracies. And how will they enforce it? Firstly, the car companies will also be required to employ a whole lot of more accountants, not people actually producing and designing and marketing these cars. They'll have to have a whole lot of new employees, again doing unproductive work in the company, to monitor all these and to comply with all this red and green tape that the government is piling on them, again pushing up the cost for these companies. And how will they enforce it? Well, the government will enforce it because they'll put the fines upon these companies. If the companies just say, well, we're not going to pay the government fines, the government will take them to court, sue them, and confiscate their assets. That's how it all works. So, yes, it seems it's just more bureaucracy, more red tape, more declines in productivity, more inefficient and unproductive workers in the economy. That's what Labor and the Greens and the Teals, unfortunately, are all about. Aussie worker, 1583 watts. Meanwhile, the Aussie dollar is down to 62 US cents. Well, that is another excellent point. The Australian dollar has fallen significantly over the last couple of months now. All these cars coming in are all imported. These car companies would have currency traders and forward exchange and hedging. They would set a position about where they thought the Australian dollar was, and they would average that out to set their prices over a period of probably 6 or 12 months. As that dollar continues to fall down, they'll be looking at all their prices. They'll be looking at I'd say that they would be have things currently priced well above that 62 cent current level. So they would be losing money on the Australian dollar, on the currency. So they would be looking at increasing very shortly all the prices to the cars that are imported in the country because of the collapse of the dollar, on top of all these additional fines and penalties they're going to apply. And that will apply to all imported goods. The more nonsense that we head down this renewables track, the less productive our economy becomes, the greater inefficiencies we actually are of people producing goods, the more our dollar collapses, the higher the cost of all these imported goods, especially cars, are going to become. There's plenty of more comments. I try and read them all. I thank you everyone for the comments on the post, and we'll keep trying to get as much information out about this, and let's try and have a fair and open debate. We just want people to understand what these policies are, how they're going to affect the cost of living in Australia, how they're going to affect the cost of motoring, which is so important to all Australians. Because this, as I said, if people understand the system of these new penalties and fines, no one would vote for them. That's why the government and the opposition are being deliberately quiet about it, trying to keep everyone in the dark so no one knows about how bad and how dramatically these policies are going to push up the cost of living in Australia. Thanks again.